Last time we spoke, Sun Kuang, Li Dingguo, and Emperor Yongle formed a sort of trinity that was chipping away at the Qing Dynasty. Each man had his own talents, and combined they proved to be a formidable foe. But divided, they would fall. Sun Kuang's jealousy led him to butt heads with Li Dingguo, undermining all the successes that they had made. When Sun Kuang was defeated, a part of the trinity was gone, and the forces of Li Dingguo and Emperor Yongle could not hope to stand against the Qing invaders as they marched into Yunnan. Emperor Yongle took flight to Burma, forcing Li Dingguo to spend years trying to rescue him from the Burmese while fighting off the looming Qing menace. In the end, even Li Dingguo could not stop the inevitable, as he and Emperor Yongle fell. Now the Qing would face their last looming menace, the King of Taiwan, Koxinga. This episode is Koxinga and the Revolt of the Three Feudatories. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we can begin, I just want to remind you all, this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment on episodes on the history of Asia and much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please, subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcast, The Pacific War Week by Week, narrated and written by me. And if after all that you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, The Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube, where I cover the history of China and Japan going as far back as the Opium Wars of the 1800s, all the way up to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. I have repeatedly said his name. In the West, we know him as Koxinga. His actual name was Zheng Chenggong. It would be his marine forces that would fight the Qing Dynasty until the bitter end. He was born with the name Zheng Sen in 1624 in Harado, Japan. His father was Zheng Jing, a Chinese merchant, and his mother was a Japanese woman named Tagawa Matsu. When Zheng was just 7 years old, his father had business interests in Quanzhou, and his family moved to Fujian province. His father would end up becoming one of the richest men in China and an admiral under the Ming Dynasty. Zheng Jing operated a pirate fleet of over 800 ships along the coast from Japan to Vietnam. The Ming appointed him Admiral of the Coastal Seas, and he basically was tasked with repelling other pirates and the Dutch East Indies Company. The fruits of his labor wound him up grabbing over 60% of Fujian province's land. Zheng Sen would pass the imperial examination at the age of 14 in 1638, becoming one of the 12 Lin Shansheng of Nan'an. Lin Shansheng basically means the best of the best as students go. In Nan'an, Zheng married the niece of a Ming official named Dong Yangsen, who was a Jianxue, meaning he held the highest imperial exam degree. So basically, Zheng was brushing shoulders with giants, so to say. In 1644, he studied at the Imperial Nanjing University. Now, when the Qing captured Beijing, Zheng's father, Zheng Jing, continued to serve the Ming, moving to Nanjing. Then after the capture of Nanjing in 1645, he accepted an offer to serve as the commander-in-chief of the Ming forces working under Prince of Tang in Fuzhou. It seems the War of Resistance had gone terribly for Zheng Jing because he became a turncoat in 1646, intentionally leaving the Zhejiang Pass unguarded and allowing the Qing to capture Fuzhou. Zheng Jing may have defected to the Qing, but Zheng's army's control lay firmly in his brother's and son's hands. That son, Zheng Sen, refused to defect to the Qing and would take most of Zheng's army with him, causing major problems. As for his wife, Tagawa Matsu, it is alleged the Qing went to Anhai, where she was residing in a castle, which I find particularly interesting since this is during the Sakako period, and it was illegal for Japanese to leave the country. Anyways, it's alleged that Qing marched upon the castle where she was and raped and killed her. Other stories state she committed suicide while resisting the Qing. Regardless of the implications of her death, the Qing knew they could not trust Zheng Jing and would have to put him under house arrest for many years until they finally executed him in 1661. It is said in 1646, while Jiang Sen was busy fighting off the Qing, he managed to return to Zhuanzhou, where he discovered his mother had been murdered or committed suicide because of the Qing, and thus a rebellion was firmly placed in his heart. I can't really get into it here, but there is an entire mythos around Lady Tagawa, and multiple perceptions on her and her legacy. When the Qing took Beijing and gave their head-shaving proclamation, Jiang Sen refused, and it is said his will was, quote, as strong and firm as a mountain. As I had said, Zheng Jilong's army did not all follow Zheng Jilong and defect with the Qing. Many would follow Jiang Sen. Soon Jiang Sen recruited more followers and organized allied armies in Nan'an and all over Guangdong. When Emperor Hongguang took the mantle, Jiang Sen flocked over to him in Nanjing. When Emperor Hongguang was defeated and executed, Emperor Longwu rose up with the support from Jiang's father. Emperor Longwu established himself in Fuzhou, and the natural defenses of Fujian province allowed him to remain safe for some time. Emperor Longwu granted Jiang Sen the name Chenggong and the title Koxinga, Lord of the Imperial Surname. In 1646, Koxinga led the Ming armies to resist the Qing, much to his father's displeasure, who wished for a more defensive stance. When the Qing finally broke into Fujian province, as I mentioned, Zheng Jilong literally opened the door to them, leaving Emperor Longwu isolated against the Qing. Well, after that, Emperor Longwu was defeated and executed. The Qing approached Zheng Jilong and got him to defect, and secretly appointed him governor of Fujian and Guangdong provinces. Despite the betrayal of his father, Koxinga chose to fight on and led Zheng Jilong's marine forces to attack Tong'an, Haicheng, Jiangfu, and captured Quanzhou and Minnan. Because the Qing never placed much emphasis on naval matters, Koxinga's naval forces basically could pick and choose at will where to do amphibious assaults, providing him with many successful raids. Zheng Jilong would send letters to his son asking him to defect to the Qing like he did, but they were to no avail, and Koxinga pledged his allegiance to the only remaining claimant to the throne, the emperor in flight, Emperor Yongle. Before Koxinga could get to Emperor Yongle, as you have guessed it, he began the process of fleeing, and this basically resulted in Koxinga never being able to link up with him. As a result, Koxinga chose to concentrate on the southeast coast of China, where he could safely move via his naval forces. Koxinga's army soon established its base of operations in Kinmen and Xiamen. Using his base of Kinmen and Xiamen, Koxinga established a marine trade network, and the anti-Qing forces grew rapidly. By 1652, Koxinga led a force of 100,000 men to attack Haicheng, Jiangtai, Jiangzhou, Jiangfu, amongst other places. He was also greatly benefited by working alongside the Jiaxi army. In 1653, Koxinga tried to coordinate with Li Dingguo's army in Guangxi and deployed his navy southwards towards Chaozhou. The following year, Li Dingguo and Koxinga agreed to meet in Guangdong and attack Xinhui together, but this plan never came to fruition. Koxinga's forces simply took too long to get there, and Li Dingguo's army was defeated and he was forced to retreat to Guangxi. In 1655, Koxinga attacked the coastal area of Fujian, defeating several Qing armies. Koxinga and Li Dingguo had planned a northern campaign where they would coordinate rear and frontal attacks upon the Qing. In May of 1656, the Qing sent Prince Jidu to attack Koxinga's territory. Prince Jidu's forces attacked Kinmen Island, Koxinga's main base for training his troops. However, a storm at sea battered the Qing ships, and as a result, they lost the battle against Kinmen Island. This also weakened the Qing naval forces in Fujian's coastal area, opening up many places for attacks by Koxinga. Then in 1658, the Qing armies carried large offensives against Li Dingguo in the southwestern area, prompting Koxinga to try and strike at the coastal areas in Zhejiang to try and relieve Li Dingguo's forces. However, Koxinga's navy was hit by a hurricane at sea, and they were forced to withdraw. This did not stop Koxinga from sending a large army to Jiaoshan, however, where he sought a base of operations to stage a siege of Nanjing. Koxinga, however, was quite eager and publicly proclaimed his intent to siege Nanjing, giving the Qing ample time to reason and prepare stronger defenses there. In 1659, Koxinga marched north alongside his colleague, Zhang Huangyan, capturing Guazhou and Jianjing before they would besiege Nanjing. They sprang through the Yangtze River, with their navy igniting resistance everywhere they went against the Qing. Koxinga's naval operations in the Yangtze River would hinder Qing supply routes and effectively starve out Beijing, stressing the hell out of the Qing court. If it is to be believed, an account by a French missionary in Beijing reported the court considered packing up and moving back to Manchuria because of what was essentially a naval blockade of Beijing. Things got so bad in Beijing, the French missionary states the populace of Beijing was waiting to see who would win the siege of Nanjing and were looking to join that said winner. The Qing were reportedly terrified of Koxinga's iron troops, who were rumored to be invincible. The siege of Nanjing shocked the Qing, but Koxinga became cocky, and in his arrogance he took his enemy lightly. He publicly announced to the populace all they had to do was join his cause and he would soon occupy Nanjing in short time. Koxinga believed that by taking Nanjing he would firmly blockade the Grand Canal and starve out Beijing, forcing them to pack up and run back to Manchuria. If the sources I talked about before are to be believed, it looked like his plan was working. Lang Qingzuo, the governor trapped in Nanjing, began to negotiate with Koxinga and Zhang. But in truth, he was biding time for the Qing forces to come to his rescue. Despite Koxinga's best efforts besieging Nanjing, the city was never completely encircled and thus able to obtain supplies and reinforcements in the form of the Qing general, Liang Huafeng. After 3 weeks of the siege, suddenly General Liang and his army burst out of the gates of Nanjing in a cavalry charge as the Ming forces were busy partying, leading to them all becoming smashed. The entire Ming army fell into disarray and began to retreat back to their ships, and Koxinga was forced to withdraw back to Xiamen. Meanwhile, his colleague Zhang had taken a ton of their forces to hit Anhui, and was now left high and dry. Zhang's army was eventually and completely collapsed, but the commander was able to escape to Tiantai, where he tried to form another resistance in the mountain range. He would fail to produce anything and by 1664 was captured and executed by the Qing. Koxinga had lost half of his land army, his colleague, and many other officers because of his arrogant attack upon Nanjing. It seems Koxinga suffered tremendous psychological damage from the major defeat and the loss of so many members of his family. He was known to be quite mentally unstable and had a horrible temper and tendency to order executions at a whim. A Dutch doctor named Christian Baer, who treated him, believed he may be suffering from syphilis. Some other contemporaries believe his mentality was the result of his Japanese upbringing, in the form of a samurai ideals on bravery. This is like laughing to showcase anger and being prone to quick violence. According to one Dr. Li Yongyue, he stated Koxinga most likely suffered from depressive insanity. Now, at this time, Li Dingguo's forces were being pushed further southwest, and quite simply, the situation did not look good for them, to say the least. This led Koxinga to gather all of his officials in secret and tell them he now intended to occupy Taiwan and establish a base there from which they could all settle their families in safety. He said that perhaps there they could unite all of those who were loyal to the Ming, and one day they would launch an attack on the Qing and fight the enemy without having to worry about the lives of their families. Thus, when the Qing marched upon his stronghold of Xiamen in 1660, Koxinga, instead of offering battle, sailed off with over 400 war junks and 25,000 troops to Taiwan. Before the departure, Koxinga had received a map of Taiwan from a Chinese merchant named He Bin, who worked for the Dutch East India Company. It was also during this time when Koxinga had the family of one of his admirals named Shang, killed because the admiral allegedly was planning to defect to the Qing, though many sources say he simply had disobeyed an order. Sheesh. Regardless, after the murder of his family, Admiral Shang promptly sailed off to defect to the Qing. The Qing were very happy to receive Shang, as he held extensive naval experience, and he had a network of contacts in major trading ports all over East Asia. He would become absolutely instrumental to the Qing naval buildup, and would emerge later in this story because of his blood feud with the Zheng family henceforth. Now, the Chinese merchant who gave Koxinga the map guided the Koxinga naval force to land on Wei Island and Haliao Island, thereby avoiding the artillery placements within the channel of Taiwan. Koxinga's forces managed to land at Pengdu, Taiwan in 1661, and Koxinga soon led his forces to attack Dutch colonists, proclaiming to them, "Hitherto, this island has always belonged to China, and the Dutch had doubtless been permitted to live there, seeing that the Chinese did not require it for themselves, but requiring it now. It was only fair that Dutch strangers who came from far regions should give way to the masters of the island." They marched to Lermang, where they fought small groups of Taiwanese aborigines and Dutch resistance. In the Bay of Lac-et-Merze, 3 Dutch ships attacked and destroyed several of Koxinga's junks, but then one of his junks got a lucky shot off, exploding a gunpowder supply aboard the Dutch flagship Hector, sinking her. The 2 other Dutch warships were not enough to fight off the large force of junks, and had to flee the scene. Here is a abridged account given by Frédéric Coyet, the colonial governor of Dutch-held Taiwan, about Koxinga's landing. The forces of Koxinga showed up armed with bows and arrows. Others had shields and swords. Everyone was wearing coats of iron scales, and this armor allowed for complete protection from rifle bullet and allowed the wearer great mobility. Their archers were their best troops, and their skill was so great it nearly eclipsed that of riflemen. They used shield men to form human walls, and Koxinga had 2 companies of black boys, many of whom were former Dutch slaves that knew how to use rifles and muskets. They proved quite effective marksmen, and caused a lot of harm to the Dutch in Taiwan. As Koxinga's force charged in rows of 12 men, and when they were near enough, sent 3 volleys of fire uniformly. The storm of arrows that came forth upon the Dutch seemed to darken the sky. The Dutch expected their return fire to send the enemy fleeing, but they did not. In fact, the Chinese held firm against them, and in short time the Dutch realized to their horror that Koxinga sent a squadron behind them, and they attacked from the rear. While the Dutch proved courageous at the beginning of the battle, they were now stricken with fear, and many Dutch riflemen tossed their rifles without even firing them and began to run. As they faltered and fled, the Chinese saw the disorder and pressed their attack more vigorously. The Chinese force charged and cut down the Dutch, and the battle raged on until the Dutch captain, Thomas Bedel, and 180 of his men were slain. After defeating the Dutch force, when they landed, Koxinga laid siege to the main fortress, Fort Zeelandia, using some of the 100 cannons he had on hand. They outnumbered the garrison there 20-1, and the bombardment demolished the roof of the Dutch governor's residence. The Dutch returned fire from bastion forts, killing hundreds of Koxinga's men. Koxinga's cannons proved ineffective against the walls. The Dutch governor wrote that after viewing the alignment of the Chinese cannons, he noticed they were placed quite badly, were unprotected, and easy to hit with their own cannons. In the end, the Chinese cannons only did some light damage to a few houses. Koxinga was shocked and enraged by the lack of damage to the fortress walls. He decided to give up the bombardment and simply begin starving the Dutch out. On April the 4th, Koxinga sent his army to besiege the smaller fortress of Fort Provincia, catching its commander Jacob Valentin and his 140 men completely off guard. Valentin had to surrender without putting up much of a fight. By late May, news of the siege of Fort Zeelandia reached Jakarta, and the Dutch East India Company dispatched 12 ships with 700 soldiers to try and relieve the fort. The relief force ran straight into Koxinga's naval blockade, and they engaged them in battle. However, Koxinga had hundreds of war junks, and the Dutch ships tried to fire upon them, and their aim ended up just being too high. Basically, there was a height difference between the Chinese war junks and the Dutch ships. This made aiming the cannons difficult, as they can't pivot downwards. So you have to rely upon distance calculations, and that turned out not to be so easy when the enemy knows just to get close to you and start firing upon you. Some of the smaller Dutch ships tried to lure some of the Chinese war junks into narrow straits, with a feigned withdrawal. But as they were doing so, the wind suddenly seized them, and with only paddles available, the Chinese caught up to them and massacred their crews with pikes. It is also alleged, when the Dutch would throw grenades at the Chinese, they would catch them with nets and toss them right back at the Dutch. That sounds like a very nasty game of hot potato. The Dutch flagship, Kapkerkin, was hit by a Chinese cannon after running aground, and she quickly sunk. Another Dutch ship hit ashore, and the crew had to run for their lives to Fort Zeelandia. The remaining Dutch fleet eventually scattered and had to withdraw. All in all, they took 130 casualties. By December, Koxinga was given reports that the garrison of Fort Zeelandia was losing morale, and thus he decided to launch another large offensive, but was repelled yet again by superior Dutch cannons. By January the 12th of 1662, Koxinga's fleet began to help bombard the fort as his ground forces assaulted it. With supplies running out and no sign of reinforcements, Governor Coyet hoisted the white flag and began to negotiate terms of surrender, finalizing them by February the 1st. By February the 9th, the Dutch left Taiwan, and they were allowed to take their personal belongings and provisions. Now, the siege was honestly a pretty horrific affair, aside from the normal war actions. Prisoners on both sides were subjected to some rather gruesome torture. A Dutch physician allegedly carried out vivisections on Chinese prisoners, and there were reports that the Chinese amputated nose, ears, limbs, and genitals of Dutch prisoners. Apparently, the Chinese would stuff their mouths with amputated genitals and send the corpses back to Fort Zeelandia. Some really messed up stuff. One Dutch prisoner, a missionary named Antonius Hambroek, was sent as an envoy to Fort Zeelandia to ask for their surrender. If he failed, well, he was killed. Hambroek went to the fort where two of his daughters were residing and urged everybody to surrender, but they did not, and thus he came back to Koxinga's camp and was promptly beheaded. Another one of Hambroek's daughters had been captured prior to the siege, and Koxinga made her a concubine. Other Dutch women and children were captured prior to the siege and were enslaved and sold to Chinese soldiers. 38 years of Dutch rule over Taiwan had ended, and Koxinga would use Taiwan as a military base for Ming loyalists. The Taiwanese aboriginals played both sides during the conflict. For example, when Koxinga's men landed in Taiwan, one tribal alliance known as the Kingdom of Midag invited Koxinga's subordinate, Chen Zi, and his men to eat and rest with them, only to kill them all in their sleep. It wasn't a small matter either. This was allegedly 1,500 soldiers. This was followed up by an ambush attack that would cost Koxinga the lives of another 700 soldiers. More and more tribal attacks mounted, and the brutality pushed Koxinga to offer the Aboriginals amnesty to help get rid of the Dutch. Many of the Aboriginals were delighted by the chance to rid themselves of the Dutch and began to hunt the Dutch colonists down, helping to execute Dutch prisoners and burn Dutch books used to educate them. Koxinga then rewarded the Aboriginals with Ming clothes, made feasts for them, gave them countless gifts such as tobacco, farming tools, and oxen. He even tried to teach them new farming techniques. Koxinga ran into a rather large problem after his major victory. Taiwan's population at the time was estimated to be no more than 100,000 people, yet he brought with him almost 30,000 soldiers and their families, so food was going to run out and rather quickly. Thus, Koxinga set to institute a Tontinian policy, that all the soldiers would serve a dual role, that of warrior and farmer. All the rich and fertile lands the Dutch had once held were immediately cut up and distributed amongst the higher-ranking officers. Much of the Aboriginal held territory on the eastern half of Taiwan was also distributed to Koxinga's men. I would like to imagine that was a very bloody ordeal, taking all that land. Then Koxinga set his eyes on piracy, performing raids against several locations near Taiwan, such as the Philippines, and even demanded the Spanish colonial government pay him tribute, threatening to attack Manila if they did not comply. The Spanish refused to pay any tribute and instead prepared the defenses of Manila. Koxinga's naval force raided several coastal towns in the Philippines, but before he could perform any real sort of invasion, in June of 1662, Koxinga suddenly died of malaria. Being somebody who specializes in the Pacific War, it's a very typical and a hell of a way to go out. Koxinga's son, Zheng Jing, succeeded his father and became king of Dongning. Zheng wanted to continue his father's planned invasion of the Philippines, but it turns out his father's little war against the Dutch did not go unnoticed by the Qing. Back on the mainland, after Koxinga left and sailed for Taiwan, the Qing began to re-implement the Haijin sea ban in 1647. The Haijin had been used in the past mostly to target Japanese piracy. Basically, it was an attempt to force all sea trade coming in to be under strict regulation, handled by Ming officials. The limited sea trade was to be tributary missions between the Ming Dynasty and their vassals, such as the Joseon Dynasty. Any private foreign trade was punishable by death, and as you can imagine, all this led up to an increase in piracy and the formation of many smugglers along the eastern coast of China. The entire idea was to starve out Taiwan by denying them trade with the eastern coast of China. But when the Haijin was re-implemented, it led to entire communities along the eastern Chinese coast to be uprooted from their native place, and they were deprived of their means of livelihood. So many communities simply had to get up and settle elsewhere. This sent many coastal areas into chaos. This ironically led to countless amounts of refugees from the eastern Chinese coast to flee to, where else? Taiwan. Then in 1663, the Qing formed an alliance with the Dutch East India Company against the Ming loyalists in Fujian and Taiwan. The Dutch, for their part, sought the alliance simply to recapture Taiwan. In October of 1663, a combined fleet of the Qing and Dutch attacked and captured Xiaomen and Kinmen from the Ming loyalists. Then in 1664, the combined fleet attacked Jiang Qing's navy, but ended up losing because it was simply too immense. One of the Qing admirals, a certain Shang, remember that guy? Yeah, like I said, he held a blood grudge against Jiang's family. Well, he advised the Qing that the Dutch were only aiding them so that they could recapture Taiwan. He said that they really didn't need the Dutch naval aid, and that he could lead the Qing Navy to take Taiwan back on his own. Thus, the alliance fell apart. The Dutch, who were probably very pissed off now, began raiding the Zhoushan Islands, where they looted relics and killed monks at a Buddhist complex at Putoshan in 1665. Pretty mean things to do. Zheng Jing's navy attacked them for this, capturing and executing 34 Dutch sailors. In 1672, Zheng Jing would attack the Dutch again, managing to ambush the Dutch ship Keilenberg in 1672 off the coast of northeastern Taiwan. So a bit of a long-lasting war between the Dutch and the Ming loyalists remains in the background. Now, from the very offset of his enthronement, Zheng Jing actually attempted to reconcile with the Qing. He sought to make Taiwan an autonomous state. Yet he refused their demands that he should shave his head in the Manchu fashion, nor would he pay tribute to the Qing dynasty. The Qing response initially, as I had mentioned, was a policy of trying to starve out Taiwan, using the Haijin. They sent the populace of the southeastern coast into chaos, and Zheng Jing continued to raid as the Qing could do nothing to stop his larger navy. The Haijin, like I said earlier, had a disastrous and rather ironic effect. Soon there was a great influx of the populace fleeing for Taiwan. Seeing the opportunity, Zheng promoted the immigration heavily and began proclaiming tons of promises and major opportunities for anyone who wished to immigrate to his kingdom. The enticement of land ownership and cultivation in exchange for military service suited many of the immigrant peasant families quite fine. But let's be honest, they really didn't have much of a choice. And it was not just peasants who came. a ton of Ming loyalists used the opportunity to flee the mainland from persecution as well. All of this led to quite an enormous boom for Taiwan. A ton of reforms came into effect that met the needs of the growing populace: agricultural, education, trade, industry, and so on. Zheng's main advisor, Chen Yonghua, also helped introduce the deliberate cultivation of sugarcane, and this came with further trade with Europeans and helped bring machinery and mass sugar refining to Taiwan. The sugar economy allowed Taiwan to become economically self-sufficient, and a booming relationship sprang with the British. You gotta love, wherever the Dutch go, the British just swoop in and steal it all from them. The Qing tried to thwart all of this with more intensive Haijin edicts, but it only made the situation worse. It was not just Taiwan that was a thorn in their side. The head-shaving order had caused a great influx of the populace to emigrate to other places than Taiwan, such as Jakarta and the Philippines. The Haijin and brief Qing-Dutch naval alliance had caused Zheng Jing to intensively exploit the lands of Taiwan, and as you might have guessed, they ran into conflict with the Aborigines. The brutality grew, and Zheng's kingdom put down many Aboriginal rebellions that had sprung up because of all the land grabbing and the taxation. A series of conflicts with the Saiziyat people in particular left them absolutely decimated, and they lost most of their land to Zheng's kingdom. Zheng Jing's kingdom enjoyed a maritime trade network with the European colonies in the Pacific, Japan, and Southeast Asia. Now, for over 19 years, Zheng tried to negotiate a peace with the now Kangxi emperor, as Emperor Shenzhi died of smallpox in 1661. Despite the peace talks, Zheng never gave up the cause of restoring the Ming Dynasty, and one last hurrah would occur. Going back to the mainland, when the Qing finally broke the last leaders of the South Ming regime, Lin Dingguo, Sun Guang, and Emperor Yongli, they had managed to do this using a lot of Han Chinese help. It was only logical that they would install more and more Han Chinese to govern the territories that they had conquered. Yet, by installing certain Han Chinese and defected former Ming loyalists in parts of the realm with varying levels of authority led to a few warlords emerging. One was Shang, a former Ming general who defected very early on in 1634. He was one of the most powerful generals to do so. He was also given the title Pingyang Wang, Prince who pacifies the south, and he helped conquer the southern province of Guangdong. When that task was finished, he was made governor of Guangdong, holding full civil and military authority. By 1637, Shang was very old and asked permission from Emperor Kangxi to retire and go back to his homeland of Liaodong. Permission was granted, and his son, Shang Jixin, would take up the mantle of Prince of Pingyan. However, Shang Jixin and his father would soon be embroiled into a revolt by the actions of others. Guangdong Ming was a Ming general who served under the Ming warlord Mao Weilong, the Sea King, if you remember him from some of our earliest episodes. Well, Guangdong Ming, alongside Kong Yuda, ended up defecting to the Qing and aided in their conquest of the south. Guangdong Ming eventually died, and his son, Gang Zimao, inherited the title of Xingnan Prince, which also means Prince of Pacifying the South, just like Pingnan Wang. He also aided in hunting down Li Dingguo and pacifying the southeast of China. Gang Zimao managed to get both of his sons, Gang Jingzhong and Gang Zhuozhong, to become court attendants under the Qing Emperor, Shenzhi, and married Aisin Gyero women. His son, Gang Jingzhong, would inherit his father's titles, including the governorship of Fujian province, and would become the warlord in Fujian, which held a strong naval force. Wu Sangui, who we all know quite well, was a Ming general who literally opened the door for the Qing to help destroy the forces of Li Zucheng. But this also led to the Qing taking Beijing. Now, Wu's career was a lengthy one. He helped defeat Li Zucheng, who executed over 38 members of Wu's family. So there was a large grudge there. For his service against Li Zucheng, Wu was given the Qin Wang, Prince of Blood title, and helped fight the Daxi army in the south alongside Shang Kexu. Wu had the absolutely horrifying job of pacifying Sichuan against the hordes of differing bandit armies and the South Ming loyalists. Then Wu became instrumental in the fight against Sun, Li, and Emperor Yongli, eventually defeating them and bringing the far reaches of Yunnan province under the Qing yoke. Now the Qing were uncomfortable placing a Manchu bannerman so far away in Yunnan or Guizhou, and thus the job was given to Wu. Wu was given the title of Pingxi Wang, Prince who pacifies the West, and control over Yunnan and Guizhou. Wu was also granted permission by Emperor Shenzhi to appoint and promote his own officials, as well as being given the rare privilege to have his first dibs on war horses before other Qing armies. By that point, because of the war against Li Dingguo, Wu already had a large army under his control, around 60,000 men. The Qing were very wary of Wu, but his rule of Yunnan had thus far caused no headaches. Wu inevitably became semi-independent and a warlord because of the great distance, though. All the money he received from taxation within Yunnan and the funds he received from Beijing were spent to expand his military. Primarily. Guess why? So let's just take a minute to summarize all of this. As a result of their great aid to the Qing, defeating the South Ming regime, basically most of South China was handed over to 3 defected Ming generals. Basically, they were awarded large fiefdoms within the Qing Dynasty. Wu Sangui was granted governorship of Yunnan and Guizhou. Shang got Guangdong, and Geng Zhengming got Fujian. Each man had their own military force and control over the taxation and other civil administration of their respective fiefdoms. Now, in the 1660s, each man began to ask the Qing government for subsidies to keep them loyal, averaging around 10 million taels of silver annually. Wu spent several million taels of silver building up his military, up to an estimated third of the Qing government's revenues from taxation. Geng Zhengming was quite a tyrant in his fiefdom and extorted the populace quite harshly before dying, upon which his fiefdom fell to his son, Gang Jimao, and then to his son, Gang Jingzhong, as I had mentioned. Shang ran a similar tyranny to Geng Zhengming in Guangdong, and the combined 3 fiefdoms emptied the Qing treasury quite quickly. Another large issue was each man simply assumed and expected his feudatory would be handed down to his offspring. But that was to be decided by the Qing emperor, not them. When Emperor Kangxi took the throne, the 3 fiefdom provinces had become financial burdens on the Qing government, and their growing autonomous control of each province were becoming a major threat to the Qing dynasty. In 1673, Shang sent a memorial to Emperor Kangxi, stating, "I am already 70 years old, and I have become weak. I hope I can be allowed to go back to Liaodong, my home place, to spend my old age. In the past, I was granted land and houses in Liaodong. I hope that your majesty will grant the land and houses to me again. I will take some officers and soldiers and old people who have been under me, 4,394 households altogether, to go back with me. There are 24,375 men and women in all. I hope the department concerned will provide food for all these people on their way to Liaodong." Emperor Kangxi replied this: "Since you sailed from the island to submit to our dynasty, you have worked very hard and established great contributions. You have garrisoned in Guangdong province for many years. I know from your memorial that you are already 70 years old. You want to go back to Liaodong. You are very sincere in your memorial. From this, I can see that you are respectful and submissive and have the overall interest at heart. I am very pleased about that. Now, Guangdong province has been pacified. I will order the kings in charge of government affairs, court officials, and the offices of the Ministry of Revenue and Ministry of Defense to discuss how to arrange the migration and settlement of the officers and men under you. I will let you know when they have made their decision." Oh, but there will be a catch to this, of course. 2 weeks later, Emperor Kangxi received another letter. In the memorial presented by Shang to your majesty, he says that he is already old and ill. He asked your majesty's permission to let his son, Shang Jixin, to succeed his title of King of Pingnan. But now Shang Qixi is still alive. There is no precedent that the son can succeed his father's title when his father is still alive. So it is not necessary to consider whether or not to allow his son to succeed his title. Emperor Kangxi agreed to this with some stipulations about the numbers of military personnel and such. Then in July of 1673, Wu Sangui asked to be permitted to retire just like Shang Qixi and to be able to settle down in some place. The emperor replied that he would speak to the court and arrange a migration. Then, a week later, Gang Jingdong asked the exact same thing, and the emperor said he would speak to his court. The court was divided on the issue, and against the majority in the court, Emperor Kangxi decided to allow each man to have their wish. Wu Sangui was going to be given land in Guizhou, but he frantically sent word to Emperor Kangxi that he required larger land because his officers and families were many. It was a bit audacious and curious that Wu Sangui began with settle down someplace, and this turned into, oh, but I really need something much bigger than that. It was like he was asking for something he knew he could not have. It turns out Wu Sangui had assumed when he had asked permission to retire that the Qing court would instead try everything they could to persuade him not to retire and to stay in Yunnan. That way, they might give him even more autonomy and more money, thus enabling him to continue building up his autonomous state even more. When the emperor said yes to his request, it must have been a real shock. To make matters worse for Wu, the emperor immediately began the process of migrating him and his men, so he freaked out. So in 1673, Wu Sangui cut off his province's connections to the Qing Dynasty and began a rebellion under the banner of Fan Qing Fu Ming, oppose the Qing and restore the Ming. He was supported by his son, Wu Shifan, and other Ming loyalists in Yunnan. Soon, they all cut off their Manchu coups and sent loyal commanders to garrison strategic passes in Yunnan province. The provincial governor of Yunnan, Zhu Guozhi, refused to join him, and so Wu Sangui had him assassinated. By 1678, Wu Sangui would declare a new dynasty. Ah shit, here we go again. Giving himself the title of King of Zhou and Great Marshal of the Expedition Army. And thus the Zhou dynasty was born. Wu Sangui ordered all of his followers to cut their Manchu coups and for all the banners to be white, and he issued white military uniforms. The next order of business was sending word to Shang Qixi, the Prince of Pingnan, and Gang Qingzhong, the Prince of Jingnan, asking them to join his rebellion. Wu Sangui sent his loyal general, Mao Bao, to command a vanguard and march on Guiyang, the capital of Guizhou. All of Guizhou surrendered without a fight. Soon word got out about the rebellion and the colossal failure of Guizhou to defend itself. Emperor Kangxi immediately ordered the migration of Shang Qixi and Gang Qingzhong to be stopped, began to rally his army to meet the new threat. Generals from multiple provinces were assembled, and estimations range quite a lot. Some say 500,000, some say 1 million troops, with the majority being Han Chinese of the Green Standard Army. Emperor Kangxi promised any general who brought him Wu Sangui's head would receive all the titles which Wu Sangui held, and any general that brought the heads of Wu Sangui's generals would receive whatever titles those generals held. So it was a pretty big incentive. Emperor Kangxi also arrested and executed one of Wu Sangui's sons, who unfortunately was still in Beijing at the time, named Wu Yingxiang. Wu Sangui's army set out of Guizhou and attacked Yuanzhou of Hunan province. Next, Quanzhou. Then his army split up, taking Hangzhou, Lizhou, Yuzhou, and Changsha. Most of the governors simply fled for their lives. Then Wu's army marched into Hubei province, attacking Yichang, Xiangyang, Yunyang, where he defeated multiple armies. Emperor Kangxi furiously ordered some of his generals to rush to Wuchang, as it was strategically important and had to be defended. The southern Qing forces had not been prepared to face the well-trained army of Wu Sangui, and they were falling like dominoes. To make matters worse, many rallied to Wu Sangui's cause, such as Sun Yanling, a general in Guangxi. Soon, Wu's army was in Sichuan, causing havoc. Everywhere Wu's army went, there were either military defeats for the Qing, retreats, or defections. Then in March of 1674, Zheng Jing began a rebellion in Fujian, declaring himself Grand General of all the armies. Soon his forces took Yanping, Shaowu, Funing, Jianning, and Qingzhou. Then Zheng Jing and Wu Sangui managed to form an agreement that they should combine forces and hit Jiangxi province together. At the same time, Zheng Jing sent an envoy to our old friend Zheng Jing, the king of Taiwan, to come and join the party by attacking prefectures and counties across the coast. Soon Zheng Jing's forces took Jiangshan, Pingyang, Wenzhou, Yueqing, Qiantai, Xianju, and Chengxian. He defeated countless armies, rallied many to his cause, and earned many defectors, amassing an army of 100,000. Then he set out to attack Shaoxing, Ningbo, Huangyan, and Jinhua before marching into Jiangxi province. From that point, Zheng and Wu took Guangxin, Jianchang, Liaozhou, Kaihua, Shoujiang, Chanan, Huizhou, Wuyuan, and Ximen. I bet you weren't expecting a geography lesson in this. Thus his forces had hit the provinces of Fujian, Jiangxi, Zhejiang, and Anhui. The southeast of China was in utter chaos. Meanwhile, Shang notified Emperor Kangxi of Zheng Jingzhong's rebellion early on. Shang was loosely related to Zheng Jingzhong. His son, Shang Juxin's wife, was Geng's younger sister. Now that Zheng Jingzhong was rebelling, he knew people would suspect he was going to rebel also, but in truth, he didn't want to. I mean, hell, the guy is 70 years old. He just wanted to retire. So he asked Emperor Kangxi if he could prove his loyalty by protecting Guangdong province from the rebels, and give his life in doing so. The emperor was so moved by this that he ordered more units and more money to be made available to Shang Qixi for the task. Now, remember, Shang Qixi was also the guy who got the confirmation that his son, Shang Juxin, would inherit all that he had, titles and all. When Wu Sangui began the rebellion, Emperor Kangxi was 20 years old, and Wu Sangui assumed he was a green horn. This means kind of like an incompetent young man with no real experience, and thus, a pushover. But very soon, Wu Sangui was facing the full might of the entire Qing Dynasty, and he certainly began to regret his decision to rebel. When his army reached Lizhou, he got word that the emperor had executed his son, Wu Yingxiang, and his grandson. Allegedly, he was eating a meal when a messenger told him, and to this he exclaimed, "The young emperor is so capable, I am doomed to fail." Quite an odd quote to say, given the circumstances, but that's how one of my sources put it. I would have assumed he'd be shouting in grief or something. Emperor Kangxi dispatched many generals to help Shang Qixi attack the rebels occupying Yuezhou, as Wu Sangui set up defenses there and sent an expeditionary force to march into Jiangxi province. The expeditionary forces took Nankang, Dujiang, and then Wu Sangui sent more expeditionary forces out of Changsha to hit Pingxiang, Anfu, Shangao, and Xinqiang. Emperor Kangxi responded by throwing titles out to countless officials, ordering them to suppress all the rebel forces, spreading like wildfire. Honestly, I can't list the amount of princes that spring up. Countless Qing generals and governors fought and died to the rebel armies. By January of 1675, Emperor Kangxi ordered Grand General Ye La, positioned in Yuanzhou, to recapture Changsha. Yue La led his forces to take Nanchang, Shanggao, Xinjiang, Danxiang, Wanyan, Anyuan, and Xincheng, defeating countless rebels. When his forces made it to Pingxiang, they were repelled. At this point, Wu Sangui ordered his men to build wooden fortresses to defend the cities without natural defenses and to build log barriers to thwart cavalry, log obstacles in the rivers to thwart naval forces, and traps everywhere. Then Wu Sangui told his troops he was going to cross the Yangtze River and break the dike near Jingzhou to immerse the city in water. While this was to occur, he ordered some of his subordinates to attack Yunyang, Jingzhou, and Nanjiang. In 1676, Wu Sangui's forces approached Guangdong, and Shang Qixi was seriously ill, leaving his son, Shang Jixin, in charge of the defense. Many of the forces simply defected to Wu Sangui, and allegedly in an effort to save his father, Shang Jixin defected, and he became a grand general in Wu Sangui's army. Ironically, and rather tragically, it seems the surrender broke Shang Qixi's heart, and he died. In December, Shang Jixin regretted his defection so much so that he sent a secret envoy to Emperor Kangxi begging to be allowed to defect back over to the Qing. And Emperor Kangxi accepted him with open arms, right back. Quite a few rebel generals began to defect back to the Qing, and the emperor kept a policy of extreme leniency, hoping to win many over without bloodshed. These were, after all, his subjects, and the emperor understood the need to avoid bloodshed whenever possible. Wu Sangui sent forces to attack Jian, while Ye La made a second attempt attacking Pingxiang. Ye La's forces had destroyed 12 enemy fortresses and killed more than 10,000 rebels before the rebel commander of Pingxiang fled. After taking Pingxiang, Yue La marched on Liling and Liaoyang before finally attacking his tasked objective, Changsha. Meanwhile, Emperor Kangxi also dispatched forces into Zhejiang province to attack Guangdong. In 1676, they attacked Wenzhou, fighting fiercely and taking multiple fortresses. Despite a fierce month-long siege, Wenzhou withstood the Qing, and thus they had to bypass it and march into Fujian province, taking Jiangshan first. Meanwhile, Zheng Jing's force arrived at Xinhua Bay to attack Fuzhou, but Geng Jingzhong was at the end of his resources, and he ended up asking permission to defect to Emperor Kangxi. He did this by asking Emperor Kangxi permission to show his newfound loyalty by attacking Zheng Jing's invading force at Fuzhou. Emperor Kangxi accepted the offer and said he could resume with his title of King of Jingnan if he was successful. The forces of Geng Jingzhong, heavily supported by the Qing army, who were initially sent to defeat him, mind you, easily defeated Zheng Jing's forces, sending him packing back to Taiwan. My god, this was a real Game of Thrones. By 1677, Wu Sangui's army were now facing stalemates all over the place, and Yue La successfully captured Changsha. Then Jian fell, as many of Wu Sangui's men simply retreated. By 1678, Yue La recovered Pingxiang and Xiangyin, defeating countless rebels and accepting many surrenders. Then Wu Sangui unleashed one of his most formidable generals, Mao Bao, to attack Yangxing, and he died in battle, failing to take the city. At this point, Wu Sangui was 76 years old. 6 years had passed since he had begun this rebellion. The vast territory he had taken in its peak was declining rapidly. His army was greatly weakened, but despite all of this, many of his officials pleaded to him that he should officially declare himself emperor. Because, of course, why not? So he proclaimed his reign title as Jiao Wu, meaning demonstrating great military power, of the Zhou Dynasty, in March. I guess go big or go home, right? He made Hangzhou of Hunan province the new capital, and like all the rest before him, began issuing titles and so forth. Then in August, he was stricken with dysentery, and he was so ill he apparently could barely speak. He ordered his son, Wu Shifan, to come to Hangzhou, and by September the 11th, he was dead. Wu Shifan decided to take the mantle, and he chose the title reign of Honghua. When Emperor Kangxi got news of Wu Sangwe's death, it was like a shark smelling blood in the water, and he sent all of his armies to crash upon Hunan. Apparently the emperor even considered leading the army himself, he was that eager. Wu Shifan's forces fled for their lives when the Qing armies marched into Hubei province. Disarray was soon rampant. Soon, Yuela's troops marched into Henan province and attacked Wugang, a place that had fairly stout defense, around 20,000 troops. The battle was very bloody. Wugang's commander was killed, his troops soon routed, and the city fell. The rebel army's morale was low. The Qing took Yuezhou, Chengde, and Hangzhou. It got to the point where the Qing faced more issues with logistics than they did actual fighting of the enemy. By 1680, the provinces of Hunan, Guizhou, Guangxi, and Sichuan fell back to the Qing, and Wu Shifan fled to Kunming. Now, once Wu Shifan was pressed into a corner in Yunnan province, the Qing general, Zhao Liangdong, formed a three-pronged attack strategy to hit Yunnan province. The attack would be performed by Cai Yurong, Jiang Tai, and Lei Tai Jiyusu. That last one sounds awfully Japanese. Probably a story there, but can't get into it. They marched through Hunan, Guangxi, and Sichuan, respectfully taking territory as they did. Wu Shifan had no reinforcements and was greatly outnumbered. The Qing generals entered Yunnan, and Kunming was besieged for months, but it still held firm. General Zhao Liangdong proposed they cut Wu Shifan's supply route on Kunming Lake, and this provided quick results. The generals then led a fierce attack upon the city. But before they could capture Wu Shifan, he had committed suicide. They decapitated his corpse and sent it back to Beijing. Now there lies just one more small story to end this tale. All the way back in 1674, Qing, as we know, sent an envoy to Taiwan to ask the help of Zheng Jing. Zheng Jing sailed to Ximing, the south part of Xiamen in southeast Fujian province. His army then captured Tong'an and marched north to attack Quanzhou, which was defended by Zheng Chenggong's army. Zheng Chenggong's men fled the scene after a quick battle, leading Zheng to capture Quanzhou. From there he took Chaozhou, defeating more of Zheng Chenggong's forces, making an enemy out of him. Then in 1675, Zheng Chenggong made peace with Zheng Jing. It seems it was all just a misunderstanding, and they began to collude again. But in 1676, Zheng Chenggong surrendered to the Qing and personally asked to be tasked with defeating Zheng Jing, so perhaps there was something more personal going on between the two. Well, Zheng Jing began the newfound war between them by besieging Quanzhou again. The siege lasted 2 months, but he was unable to take it this time. Zheng Jing lifted the siege and instead attacked Fuzhou, but by now the Qing forces were crashing into Fujian province. The forces fought for various cities such as Quanzhou, Qingzhou, and Zhangzhou. In 1676, Zheng Jing laid siege again for a third time against Quanzhou, but the Qing in the meantime had taken 10 counties back and were overwhelming Zheng Jing's armies. He lifted the siege yet again and fled back to Ximing, and by 1678 a Qing envoy showed up demanding his surrender. Emperor Kangxi followed this up by sending naval forces to Fujian province to attack Kinmen Island. En route, a Qing naval force led by Wan Chengse attacked Heitan Island. During the ensuing battle, 16 of Zheng Jing's ships were destroyed, with more than 3,000 soldiers drowned. Zheng Jin's admiral at the scene, Zhu Tiangui, had to flee, and Wan Zhense pursued him. Soon, Meizhou Island, Nanri Island, Pinghai County, and Chongwu County were seized by the Qing naval forces. Then land forces and Wan Zhengse consolidated and attacked Zheng Jing's forces in Xiamen. They smashed his army there. Zheng Jing tried to flee to Kinmen, but the Qing attacked it simultaneously, forcing him to sail all the way back to Taiwan. In 1781, shortly after arriving in Tianan, Zheng Jing died of dissipation on March 17th. Zheng Jing's eldest and illegitimate son, Zheng Chenggong, was appointed as supervisor of the state. Now, Zheng Chenggong was the next in line to take the throne, but this is where that illegitimate part comes up. Two very hungry political officials hated Zheng Chenggong. Their names were Feng Xifan, the head of the bodyguards, and Liao Guoxian, a high-ranking military officer. Upon Zheng Jing's death, they both began to slander Zheng Chenggong by stating he was not the biological son of Zheng Jing in front of the Queen Dowager Dong. The men then launched a coup with the help of Zheng Jing's brother, Zheng Chenggong, against Zheng Chenggong, killing him and installing his 12-year-old little brother, Zheng Chenggong, upon the throne. There are so many Zhengs. Yeah, so Taiwan is some real Game of Thrones shit right here. Meanwhile, Emperor Kangxi and the Qing court heard about the coup and that a 12-year-old emperor was just placed upon the throne, and they soon realized the time was ripe to attack the politically divided and certainly weak island of Taiwan. And so, the Qing court officially recommended our old friend Xu Lang, the man who had a blood feud with the Zheng's family, to command the entire Qing navy against Taiwan. Thus, Xu Lang was made commander-in-chief of the naval force and was ordered to take the Pengdu Islands and then Taiwan. Xu Lang rallied 20,000 crack troops and 300 warships for an invasion of Pengdu. Xu Lang also took the time to purchase a number of Dutch-made cannons for his big ships. Oh yes, don't forget about the pissed-off Dutch. They didn't forget about Taiwan. Liao Guoxian of Taiwan knew the Qing would attack Pengdu first, so he sent a large force there to prepare its defenses. In June of 1683, Xu Lang's navy sailed out from Tangshan and captured a few small islands along the way to Pengdu. Now Xu Lang divided his force into smaller fleets before engaging the enemy. He sent one detachment to slip around the planned naval battle and to land covertly near Liao Guoxian's base on Pengdu. Liao Guoxian was no fool, however, and he placed numerous cannons and troops along the beaches to thwart such attacks. On June the 16th, the Battle of Pengdu commenced, and many of Liao Guoxian's larger ships targeting the smaller fleets of Xu Lang, encircling them. Seeing this unfold, Xu Lang took his flagship personally in to break up the encirclements. As the battle raged, a stray arrow hit Xu Lang in the eye, spraying blood everywhere. But Xu Lang fought on. Xu Lang managed to break the encirclement, killing 3,000 enemy soldiers, and by June the 18th he captured Hujing Island, just southwest of Pengdu Island proper, and then Tongpanyu Island to its southwest. On June the 22nd, Xu Lang organized multiple simultaneous attacks to throw the enemy off balance. He sent 50 warships to hit Zilangyu and Sijiashan, situated on the west of Pengdu Island. Another 50 warships to hit Niuxinwan Bay to attract the enemy's attention, as he sailed off personally with 56 warships right through the center to hit Pengdu Island proper. The enemy sent all their warships out to meet his separate forces, and from 7 a.m. to 5 p.m. they fought bitterly. The Qing managed to outflank and break the enemy's formation, but they fought on tenaciously still. In the end, the Qing won a battle of attrition, as they had significantly more ammunition than the rebel navy, whom was forced to resort to boarding ships and doing melee fighting. Many rebel leaders chose not to surrender, and they went down fighting to the end in a blaze of gunfire and glory. Over 194 enemy warships were destroyed. More than 12,000 enemy soldiers were killed. Seeing he was going to lose the battle, Liao Guoxian took his fastest ship and he fled his ass back to Taiwan. Xu Lang's detachment that slipped past the battle landed ashore and were met with an onslaught of cannons and arrows from the beaches. However, the Qing warships began to tip the scale in firing power, breaking open pockets for amphibious assaults, and soon the Qing soldiers were breaking through towards Liu Guoshen's base. The Qing defeated the garrison at the base and raised the Qing banner triumphantly. On July the 15th, Zheng Chenggong sent envoys to Pengdu Island to offer his terms of surrender to Shang. By August, Shang accepted their surrender in Taiwan, and on August the 18th, Zheng Chenggong and all of his officers and officials shaved their heads in the Manchu style. All of them positioned themselves to face the direction of Beijing, and they bowed. Taiwan was now part of the Qing Empire. Shang was granted by Emperor Kangxi the title of General of Jinghai. Jinghai meaning pacifying the sea. Zheng Chenggong and his highest officials were escorted to Beijing, and Zheng Chenggong was granted the title Duke of Haicheng. Bet you thought he was going to get executed. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. So please, go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcast, the Pacific War Podcast Week by Week, narrated and written by me. And if after all of that, you are still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube, where I have content going as far back as the Opium Wars of the 1800s, all the way up to the end of the Pacific War in 1945. Give it a look, it'll mean a lot to me. The Qing War for unification was actually over. Of course, there would be countless other rebellions during the reign of the Qing Dynasty, but as for the threat of the Ming takeover, that was now a thing of the past. Kind of. A brand new world was emerging, however, and when the 19th century would roll in, with it would come devious trouble. For the century of humiliation was mere decades from commencing its ugly start.